So this is my presentation entitled Another Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Ecocide. This presentation is mainly going to be about climate change, which is one form of ecocide that's occurring on a global scale. So a couple months ago I read the book A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide by Samantha Power. Now this is a book about America's tendency to turn a blind eye towards genocide. And as I'm reading it, I'm realizing if you just replace genocide with climate change, our response is almost identical. So there's actually a lot of lessons we can learn from the prevention of genocide that we can apply to climate change. So I thought the message we were supposed to have learned from the Holocaust was never again. And nobody's going to disagree with this. Do we value the prevention of genocide? I think on the surface the answer is yes. But the discrepancy comes in with how broad of a definition do we give never again. So after the Holocaust there was Cambodia, and then Iraq, and then Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, and the list just keeps going. So some people actually have a very narrow definition of never again. And they set the bar so high that if something isn't almost exactly like the Holocaust, it's almost as if it doesn't count. That goes that never again to them means never again shall the Nazis kill the Jews in Germany in the 1940s. But if you have a very narrow definition, you're probably going to be blind to the warning signs of future genocides. So will we try to stop it before it happens again, or even as it's happening? Again, this depends. So some people value sovereignty and isolationism. To me, sovereignty means this is the state providing for the well-being of its citizens. It doesn't give the state the right to kill its citizens. But there's a minority, a very vocal minority, that thinks this way, and that actually gives them the competitive advantage over the passive majority. And so in these regards, our collective response to genocide is really no different than our collective response to ecocide.
The warning signs of climate change are all around us, even though not all of us might notice them. So, do we value a livable future? I think on the surface, the answer to that question is yes. But just like for genocide, there's a vocal minority of people that don't want to do anything about it. So, in the US, 20% of the population is dismissive or doubtful, versus 57% of the population that's either alarmed or concerned. So why might people be opposed to doing anything about climate change? Well, it usually comes down to political identity. We have a certain economic system, a lot of people favor small government, and for some, it's their worldview in general. So based on these values, there are certain narratives that take hold that would cause people not to want to believe in climate change. Another thing that's hard about climate change is that, just like how genocide is obscured by the fog of war, climate change is kind of obscured by the fog of abstraction. And so maybe by talking about it in this way, it'll give people something they can relate to. And lastly, there's a socially constructed silence. We're doing a lot better now. Climate change entered the public space in the United States probably about a couple years ago. Even though people's initial reaction was one of concern needs to be transformed into alarm so that it can be channeled into action. Public opinion polls show that we're building momentum, but there's still a long way to go. Climate change still isn't the top priority for most people. So let's move on and talk about what we can learn from the lessons of genocide prevention.
In the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire became increasingly suspicious and resentful of its Christian Armenian population. Sultan Abdul Hamid II launched a pogrom that killed hundreds of thousands of Armenians. And then, in 1908, a new Turkish government took power, and it was even more determined to solve the Armenian problem. During World War I, the Turkish Minister of Interior Affairs, Mehmed Talat, boasted that he has accomplished more towards solving the Armenian problem in 3 months than Abdul Hamid accomplished in 30 years. This outraged the U.S. ambassador Henry Morgenthau. He threatened that U.S. public opinion would not tolerate these actions. Talat just couldn't understand why Morgenthau should care about the internal affairs of Turkey. After all, Morgenthau was a Jew and an American. The Armenians were Christians, and Turkey treated the Americans all right. Talat believed in collective guilt. Innocent Armenians would eventually become guilty, so they all must be punished. But Morgenthau's threats didn't go unheeded. Talat stopped boasting and started carrying out the atrocities more discreetly. As would become standard practice, he used the fog of war as cover. These atrocities were all well documented at the time, but a policy of official denial was started that still persists in Turkey to this day. Back in the U.S., President Woodrow Wilson was determined to keep the U.S. out of war, and so he didn't want to make waves with Turkey or their German allies. This sent a very clear signal that the U.S. wouldn't interfere. He wasn't about to rile up the public either. Former President Teddy Roosevelt, however, was very vocal about intervention. To him, allowing the killings to occur was as cowardly as men escaping on a life raft before women and children. After the war, Talat fled to Germany where he wouldn't be extradited. There just wasn't any international legal recourse for this massacre. Also, Wilson's narrow interests may have had long-term consequences. Someone else was paying attention to the world's indifference. Hitler noticed in the years leading up to World War II that no one spoke of the Armenians. He decided the aim of war was to annihilate the opposition and would once again exploit our tendency to look away. And this wasn't just the bystanders. His eventual victims would also be incredulous to the warning signs. While ecocide as a war strategy is a crime, ecocide in general is not. The lawyer Polly Higgins had a life-changing epiphany one day. She was looking out the window of the Court of Appeal after defending someone for workman's compensation and noticed, the Earth is also being harmed, and no one's really looking out for it. So I think the Earth needs a good lawyer. She basically changed everything she was doing and took on this case. In 2010, she began a process to try and have ecocide recognized as a crime against peace as part of the Rome Statute. She argued that ecocide leads to resource depletion, conflict, war, damage and destruction, and this just perpetuates this downward spiral. As she soon discovered, ecocide was originally part of the Rome Statute, but it was removed in 1996 because 3 countries opposed its inclusion. These 3 countries were the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America. This doesn't come as much of a surprise to me. The United States' track record on ecocide is about as good as its track record on genocide. In the US, there's opposing narratives that try to frame environmentalists as a bunch of people that think trees are sacred. And for some of them, that may be true, but I think many environmentalists have the aim of preventing war. And I don't think the anti-environmental crowd really understands this very much. There are 10 countries that do have national ecocide laws. Vietnam's a good example because they felt the effects of ecocide firsthand during the war. Other countries include Armenia, Georgia, and several of the former Soviet Union nations such as Kazakhstan and Ukraine. Polly Higgins' definition of ecocide is the extensive destruction, damage to, or loss of ecosystems of a given territory, whether by human agency or by other causes, to such an extent that peaceful enjoyment by its inhabitants of that territory has been severely diminished. I like this definition because what she's saying is that in addition to anthropogenic ecocide, natural ecocide is also included. Countries would be responsible for helping each other when disasters happen. And it's easy to predict the objections to this. Many people value isolationism and are threatened by globalism, but it's not really about that. It's not about unity or one world. It's about separate states cooperating based on a set of common principles and interests. So I hadn't heard of Polly Higgins before I came across her name as I was researching the history of ecocide. And unfortunately, she fell victim to cancer last year in 2019. It was her wish that others would learn the importance of her work and fight for it to become law. If there was a law that covered ecocide in general, it would also cover climate change. But as of now, climate change is also not a crime. Well, let's do the math. There's more CO2 in currently operating oil and gas wells and coal mines than is safe to burn in still standard 2 degrees C. Yet, we continue to allow fossil fuel companies to expand their infrastructure. And now the melting of Arctic sea ice is clearing a path for even more oil exploration. We know what the result's going to be, but this isn't a crime. The external costs just get passed on to everyone else. That sounds fair. The oil executives are exploiting our tendency to look away. They push demand-side narratives that transfer the responsibility to us knowing that we're averse to making sacrifices. They wage misinformation campaigns that give us pseudo-alibis. They fund political candidates that become loyal to them and create a culture of denial. And it's difficult for any of us to grasp the enormity of this situation. Few of us have developed the imagination required to understand cognitively and emotionally what this means for our futures. The law is lacking in a big way, and it must be built. Hitler wasn't the only one to notice humanity's weak response to the Armenian genocide. The Polish linguist Raphael Lemkin came across a news article about Soghomon Tehlirian. Tehlirian was part of a column of several thousand Armenians that were being forcibly moved and massacred by the Turkish authorities. He witnessed his entire family being killed, but he was only knocked unconscious and presumed dead. When he regained consciousness, he assumed he was the only survivor. Eventually, he made his way to Boston where he entered into a conspiracy to assassinate Talat. This story astounded Lemkin because of the moral inconsistency. To kill a man as well as uphold the moral order of mankind, as Tehlirian had done, was a crime, but for his oppressor to kill 1 million men was not? Lemkin wasn't moved by the argument of state sovereignty. Tehlirian was eventually acquitted on the grounds of temporary insanity, but Lemkin took it upon himself to make sure that retribution would eventually become legalized. This idea motivated Lemkin to become a lawyer and present his draft law relating to barbarity and vandalism at an international criminal law conference in Madrid. The Polish foreign minister at the time, however, was attempting to endear himself to Hitler, and so he wouldn't allow Lemkin to travel to the conference. It had to be read aloud in Lemkin's absence. When this happened, the German delegation got up and left in protest, and the other lawyers in the room couldn't say no, but they also wouldn't say yes. Lemkin was later fired as deputy public prosecutor for criticizing Hitler. But Lemkin persevered. He kept traveling and speaking at other conferences. Finally, after Germany invaded Poland and a radio broadcast warned able-bodied men to leave Warsaw, Lemkin took flight with some of the civilians around him actually being killed in the early conflicts of the war. Lemkin sought refuge with a Jewish family in eastern Poland. He tried to warn them to no avail. They didn't have the imagination to fully process what he was telling them. Next, he made his way to his own family, also in eastern Poland. They too had a similar reaction. They just couldn't believe what Hitler was really intent on destroying every last Jew. It defied conventional wisdom and logic. Lemkin was living his parents' funeral while they were still alive. He'd been studying this crime for over a decade. He'd developed the imagination, but most of the rest of the world hadn't yet caught up. Lemkin eventually made his way to Sweden and then to the United States. One of Winston Churchill's speeches caught his attention. Churchill referred to Hitler's atrocities as a crime without a name. This resonated with Lemkin. As a linguist, he knew that words mattered. This prompted him to coin the term genocide. It was a term that would have specific meaning and couldn't be confused with other types of war crimes. The legal definition of genocide is as follows: any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Ecocide was coined in 1968 by the plant physiologist Arthur Galston. In his early work, he discovered that triiodobenzoic acid in large enough quantities was an effective herbicide. The U.S. military built upon his work, and this led to the advent of Agent Orange. The United States released about 20 million gallons of Agent Orange to destroy crops and expose Viet Cong positions during the Vietnam War. Agent Orange had a devastating effect on mangrove ecosystems and their inhabitants. The life cycle of certain migrating fish was cut short. Galston was outraged at how his scientific discoveries were weaponized. He became a vocal bioethicist and lobbied the Department of Defense. Additionally, he investigated the health effects of Agent Orange. It was found to cause cancer, birth defects, and learning disabilities. Nixon became aware of this and he stopped its use, and eventually ecocide was outlawed as a war tactic in international law. Anthropogenic climate change dismissives and doubters like to say that global warming was changed to climate change because global warming's been debunked and climate always changes. But the real story is that 3 days before leaving office, President Bill Clinton adopted tougher standards for arsenic levels in water. Well, this would have been a good thing in general. If Clinton really wanted to make drinking water safer, he would have done this long before he left office. This would have increased costs, so Bush put it back the way it's always been since 1942. But what the public saw was Bush loosening the standards for arsenic. This and the perception that Republicans value profit over pollution made Republicans look weak, especially on the environment. In order to improve their image, the Republican strategist Frank Luntz wrote Bush a memo in 2002 describing his strategy. The memo was later leaked. He advised dropping global warming and replacing it with climate change because climate change sounds less scary. Luntz wrote that the scientific debate is closing, but not yet closed. There is still a window of opportunity to challenge the science. He also wrote, a compelling story, even if factually inaccurate, can be more emotionally compelling than a dry recitation of the truth. It's no wonder environmentalists were outraged by this memo, but you know what? That was 18 years ago. Like so many of us back then, Luntz was clearly in denial. This doesn't make him a bad person, it just means that he hadn't sufficiently processed the information at that time. So I just finished reading Common Sense for the 21st Century by Roger Hallam, and he puts it pretty well. Knowing is not a binary concept when it comes to grief-inducing catastrophic information. We're all in denial to some extent. Like the Polish foreign minister, Luntz backed the losing strategy. And like the ordinary people of Lemkin's day, he has a lot to lose. His home in California almost burnt down in a wildfire a few years ago. He's since admitted he was wrong, which is a really tough thing to do considering how nasty environmentalists have been towards him. But if someone's willing to change and take action, we really need to forgive. He's on our side now, and we'd be wise to listen to him. Lemkin was determined to build the law. He took a position at Duke. He also lobbied Henry Wallace, FDR's vice president, several times. Wallace didn't have an emotional connection to the issue, so Lemkin tried to go directly to FDR, and he was essentially asked to compress the pain of millions, the fear of nations, the hopes for salvation from death into a single page. Eventually, FDR replied that he understood, but what Lemkin was asking for was too difficult, and he needed patience. This really set Lemkin off, considering the urgency of the situation. Lemkin eventually took a position as a chief consultant for a government agency, but he still wasn't making any progress. That's when Lemkin realized that in order to convince politicians, he would first need to convince the public. His plan was to make the recognition of truth less of a personal favor and more of a logical necessity. News started to make its way to the public, and people slowly began to grasp what was happening. Lemkin contributed to the public knowledge by authoring the book Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, wherein he describes a legal perspective of Hitler's genocidal plans. After the war, Lemkin pushed for genocide to be included in the Nuremberg trials. The prosecution, however, was intent on charging the Nazis with war crimes and didn't want to risk experimenting with this new concept of genocide. Lemkin aimed to close that loophole. Man builds the law, and without mention of genocide, it could happen again. In Paris, in 1948, Lemkin's 15-year battle to have genocide recognized by an international law finally became a reality. There were still many critics. Lemkin noted that if somebody doesn't like the mustard, he will always find a reason that he doesn't like it, even after you've convinced him that the previous reason has no validity. This is the same principle that Jonathan Haidt describes as judgment first, rationalization second. Little did Lemkin know at the time that his struggle was still far from over. There is still no international law prohibiting ecocide or one for limiting the extraction of fossil fuels, but there have been attempts internationally to reduce the emissions that contribute to climate change. The Kyoto Protocol was an attempt by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to limit greenhouse gas emissions. It was originally set to expire in 2012, but the Doha Amendment kept it going until 2020. The Paris Accord was designed to pick up where Kyoto left off. At the national level in the United States, the Waxman-Markey cap-and-trade bill failed in 2008. Not that it would have been all that effective anyway, but it highlights the rise of climate denial in Congress. Cap-and-trade was a market-based idea originally used to solve acid rain, and it did so effectively. But this time around, Republican congressmen weren't so keen on the idea. Congress more closely represents the interests of the fossil fuel lobby than the American people, and the people allowed this because it wasn't their top priority. There wasn't enough political will to get this passed. Climate legislation came to a halt afterwards for several years until the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. This is another attempt at a market-based bipartisan climate legislation, placing a fee on fossil fuels at the point that they enter the market and then rebating the fee 100% back to the households. The basic idea behind this is widely accepted by economists across the political spectrum, and it continues to gain support as the public begins to understand what it is and how it fits with their principles. The Green New Deal is an all-encompassing plan to solve climate change based on the New Deal. The New Deal was a collection of public works projects that brought America out of the Great Depression, and it did so with a practical combination of government spending and encouragement of private investment, contrary to the popular narrative of big government. The problem back then was that most investments were considered too risky, and without investments, capitalism flounders. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation set up a lending system for private capital for publicly desirable projects. The Federal Housing Administration made mortgages less risky via insurance reform. The Rural Electrification Administration was financed by rural cooperatives to bring electricity to rural areas, and the Defense Plant Corporation heavily invested in aerospace rather than just weapons so that the economy remained strong during and after World War II. This was the time that America was at its greatest, and it wouldn't have happened without the New Deal. Yet, it seems Herbert Hoover's opposition has returned with a vengeance. The difference now is that many Americans don't have the imagination to understand how climate change will hurt them. During the Great Depression, the unemployment rate reached nearly 25%, so people urgently wanted change. The Green New Deal was successful in bringing climate change into the public space and advancing the conversation, but it also creates solution aversion on the political right. Rather than attack the Green New Deal, right-wing pundits should suggest alternative aggressive solutions that are grounded in science. This should be a wake-up call. If they don't start taking this threat seriously, they're not going to have a voice in how we transition. With young people motivated to solve climate change, public pressure is mounting, and it's only a matter of time. Not that time's on our side or anything. Lemkin continued his crusade in order to get the United States to ratify the Genocide Convention until he died of a heart attack in 1959. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 10 times, but he was living within a society that would rather deny than acknowledge genocide. He tended to irritate those that he interacted with, and in the end, only 7 people attended his funeral. In 1967, William Proxmire, the Wisconsin senator that replaced the late Joseph McCarthy, took up the cause. Proxmire was a man of principle. He didn't understand why this hadn't been accomplished yet, especially since 70 other countries had ratified the law. He intended to speak to the Senate every day until ratification, and he had plenty of ammunition for people who thought that genocide didn't occur frequently enough to matter. In 1968, he drew attention to the Christian Igbo resistance in Nigeria, in which the Nigerian government starved and killed over 1 million innocent men, women, and children to suppress the rebellion. In 1971, the Awami conflict in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, resulted in the slaughter of over 1 million, and the United States was unwilling to even condemn Pakistan because Pakistan was our intermediary to China at the time. In 1972, over 100,000 Hutus were killed in Burundi. The U.S. could have stopped importing coffee from Burundi, but they chose not to. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge leveraged the narrative of fear of American bombing and took power in Cambodia, but the U.S. still disliked Vietnam more. Also in 1975, Indonesia massacred the citizens of East Timor. A culture of isolationism, xenophobia, and state sovereignty provided the excuses for the opposition, but Proxmire noted that the true opponents to ratification in this case are not groups of individuals. They are the most lethal pair of foes for human rights everywhere in the world: ignorance and indifference. Between 1967 and 1986, William Proxmire gave 3,211 speeches regarding genocide on the Senate floor. In the beginning, the public was mostly indifferent even to the Holocaust. It's a testament to the will of the Jewish groups that the memory of the Holocaust is preserved. In 1953, an episode of This Is Your Life featured Hannah Black-Conner and introduced America to a Holocaust survivor. An early dramatization of the Diary of Anne Frank changed the ending because people weren't ready for the real ending. In the play, Anne says, "In spite of everything, I still believe people are good at heart." What she really wrote was, "I simply can't build up my hopes on a foundation consisting of confusion, misery, and death." In the late 1960s, the Library of Congress added a category for the Holocaust. It wasn't until the 1970s that it was acceptable topic for public discourse. Neither Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, nor Carter would ratify the Genocide Convention, but the politics fondly aligned under Reagan. Reagan was trying to honor his friendship with Germany and Chancellor Kohl, and planned a visit to the cemetery in Pittsburgh where several Nazi Waffen SS officials were buried. After the press found out, there was a public outcry, but Reagan wasn't one to back down. Elie Wiesel said of this, "The issue here is not politics, but good and evil. We must never confuse them, for I have seen the SS at work, and I have seen their victims. They were my friends. They were my parents." Jewish groups are enraged, and protests occurred in several cities across the U.S. Reagan chose to ratify the Genocide Convention in order to regain support. This caused the congressional opposition to switch tactics. They introduced reservations that would make it so that the U.S. would have to agree to participate in an international court of justice. And if the U.S. could do this, so could countries with genocidal regimes. The reservations would take away any real power that the law had and make it merely symbolic. But at least the U.S. could use it diplomatically, and the Soviet Union would no longer be able to call us out on not having ratified the Genocide Convention. Even after this bittersweet accomplishment, it was still another 2 years before Proxmire could get Congress to stop delaying the implementation of the legislation. And, as history shows, the genocide law didn't make the U.S. acknowledge genocide any more than it already had been previously. William Proxmire's climate counterpart is Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Instead of a speech a day, Whitehouse delivers his Time to Wake Up speech weekly. At the time of this recording, he's accumulated 264 speeches over nearly 8 years. Many of these speeches can also be found on YouTube. And from the looks of it, just like Proxmire, Whitehouse is speaking to a sparsely populated Senate chamber. His talks discuss scientific findings, how climate change will affect Rhode Island as well as everywhere else, and he exposes the political strategies used to create a culture of denial. According to Whitehouse, also several of his Republican Senate comrades would act on climate change but currently lack the political cover. If any of them were to come out, they fear that the fossil fuel industry would run a smear campaign against them and they would lose their seat. The science has only become all too clear since the early 1980s, when the National Academy of Sciences and the EPA issued reports warning about global warming. Whitehouse is desperately trying to get the U.S. to act, but unlike Proxmire, he isn't focused on a single piece of legislation. The Kyoto Protocol was never ratified by the United States, and it expires soon anyway. We have, however, learned some lessons from Kyoto. Clinton and Gore were met with a hostile Congress that refused to ratify it because it let developing countries like China and India off the hook. If the U.S. was to participate, all countries would need to be liable, and the agreement would most likely need to be non-binding. Canada originally ratified the Kyoto Protocol, but they dropped out after they realized that they wouldn't hit their targets to avoid penalties, so even binding measures can have little impact. The Paris Accord will go into effect soon. Developing countries like China and India will share the responsibility, and the targets are voluntary. But this is still asking too much from the opposition. Trump intends to withdraw from Paris if he wins re-election. It's pretty clear that the original complaint had very little to do with fairness over distribution of responsibility from developing nations. They simply just don't like the mustard.
The United States may have ratified the Genocide Convention, but it had economic interests at stake in Iraq. Rather than denounce genocide against the Iraqi Kurds, it looked the other way. The Kurds are a stateless people that might have had their own state after World War I had Turkey ratified the Treaty of Sèvres, but this treaty would have held Turkey accountable for crimes against the Armenians, and so it didn't happen. The Kurds are opportunists, and during the Iran-Iraq War, Kurdish Peshmerga rose up against Saddam Hussein to fight for their independence. Saddam Hussein used the fog of war to launch his Anfal campaign to rid Iraq of its Kurdish problem. Baghdad could keep a close eye on the urban Kurds, but it attempted to dismantle rural Kurdistan. The rural Kurds became implicated victims. There were some rebel elements, and Hussein used this to justify his indiscriminate killings, forced relocations, and poison gas attacks. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff member Peter Galbraith noticed on his second trip to Iraq that many of the villages he had seen on his previous trip were no longer there. They had been bulldozed off the map. Galbraith eventually became the leading Kurdish advocate within the U.S. government. The Kurdish activist and future president of Iraq, Jalal Talabani, attempted to lobby Washington and advocate for the Kurds. This is where he initially met Galbraith. Talabani was initially invited to the State Department and given a warm welcome, but this move ultimately backfired because both Turkey and Iraq thought that this would incite the Kurds to cause more trouble for them. The State Department then shut Talabani out and sent a message to Iraq that it valued their mutual economic ties more than the Kurds. After using chemical weapons on Iran with no consequences, Iraq decided to use chemical weapons against the Kurds too. The U.S. supplied Iraq with more than $500 million per year in credits to purchase American farm products through the Commodity Credit Corporation, money that would be used to bolster their military for when we would eventually go to war with them. The U.S. also didn't want to interfere with Iraq's sovereignty and risk derailing this budding relationship. As a result, denial of the chemical attacks took hold within the U.S. government. Either the gassings didn't happen, Iraq wasn't responsible, or there wasn't yet enough evidence. Galbraith knew he had to dispel these myths, and even went so far as to obtain bees that had been killed in the gas attacks. Unfortunately, the chemical agents decomposed quickly and the tests were inconclusive. It wasn't until the chemical attack on Halabaya, also known as the Kurdish Hiroshima, that the culture of denial began to erode. Halabaya is less than 20 miles from Iran, and Western journalists were able to make their way there, especially since Iran was eager to expose the atrocities of its adversary. Over 5,000 people died and thousands more were injured in the attack, not including the cancers and birth defects that would follow. In response to the attack, Galbraith drafted the Prevention of Genocide Act that was sponsored by Rhode Island Senator Claiborne Pell. Galbraith understood that chemical weapons weren't any more evil than guns, but he was also being opportunistic by capitalizing on the fear of chemical weapons and the timing. The Foreign Relations Committee had already concluded its last meeting of the year, so the measure was hotlined through without first going through the committee. North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms, a prior antagonist of the Genocide Convention, also signed on as a co-sponsor because his principles dictated standing up to flagrant regimes, and also his wife was moved by meeting 3 Kurds on a hunger strike. The Prevention of Genocide Act may have slipped through the Senate, but when it got to the House, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Illinois Representative Dan Rostenkowski, moved to have the bill blue-slipped back to the Senate. The special interests that would have had to make sacrifices under the imposed sanctions lobbied hard, and Rostenkowski felt obliged to appease them. All was not lost, though. The House came up with their own version that was much more limited in scope. It would only ban export-import credits for U.S. manufactured goods and chemicals that could be used to produce chemical weapons. But then Florida Representative Dante Fascell removed the sanctions bill from the tax bill that was going to pass and made the sanctions standalone. It didn't pass. Iraq eventually grew bold enough to invade Kuwait. The United States could no longer hide behind state sovereignty when Iraq crossed an internationally recognized border, and the United States' oil interests were threatened. The U.S. finally stopped thinking it could convert Saddam Hussein into the partner that it wanted him to be. Gradually, many of the antagonists to sanctions changed their tune. Rather than argue how sanctions would hurt businesses, the arguments became businesses wouldn't want their products aiding a genocidal regime. President Bush gave a speech calling on the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands. This caused Shiites to rise up in the south and Kurds to rise up in the north. Galbraith felt compelled to break the rules and travel to Iraqi Kurdistan without approval to assess what the U.S. should be doing. He penned a touching note to his son in the event that he got killed in the conflict. But he didn't really have a choice in his own mind. Not going would be to sacrifice his own principles. Iraq began to crush the Kurdish rebellion, sending refugees flooding into Turkey. Once again, this became an international problem, and the images of the Kurdish refugees finally got the U.S. to act. The U.S. launched Operation Provide Comfort to establish a no-fly zone over Iraqi Kurdistan and protect the Kurds from Saddam. Approximately 100,000 Kurds were killed during Hussein's Anfal campaign.
Just as corporate interests prevented the U.S. from using good judgment in Iraq, the same holds true for the climate. The narrative of individual responsibility is meant to diffuse the responsibility away from corporations, but there are 100 companies that are responsible for 70% of the total emissions. As we've seen from the quarantine during the coronavirus pandemic, even when everyone cuts way back on their individual consumption, it may reduce air pollution from car exhaust, but it barely makes a dent in net carbon emissions, especially when the government gives polluting industries free rein during the same time period. The most notorious corporate villains have been the Koch brothers. They stood to profit from the status quo. Charles was especially skilled at social engineering. He knew that in order to convince the public, all he had to do was provide narratives that would frame their industrial activities as being in the people's best interests. They pushed narratives that attempts to stop carbon pollution would harden the economy, which of course no one wants. They're prepared to take us 4 degrees and beyond. According to an exhibit at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History entitled The Hall of Human Origins, future humans will adapt, possibly becoming tall and narrow like a giraffe, or increasing their sweat production, so there's no need to worry. One of David's organizations, Americans for Prosperity, aimed to kill one of the most efficient tools that exists to combat global warming. Many Republican members of Congress have taken the Americans for Prosperity no carbon tax pledge. Thankfully, this only applies to revenue-positive taxes, and revenue-neutral taxes like the one proposed in H.R. 763 are technically exempt from this pledge. The Kochs have been a major roadblock to achieving any meaningful climate policy, though. Just like when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the narrative has begun to shift. The cost of renewable energy has been dropping and is now competitive with fossil fuels, even with the enormous fossil fuel subsidies. Corporations are starting to realize that being pro-climate won't hurt their bottom line, and in fact may even help it. Employees at large companies have been applying the pressure too, like the Amazon Employees for Climate Justice Group. So far, 683 businesses have endorsed H.R. 763. Under this plan, everyone, including the poorest and most vulnerable, would be compensated. This would increase their disposable income, and the healthcare sector is actually expected to benefit the largest under this plan. Our tendency to look away from genocide in Iraq was not an anomaly. It was a continuation of a pattern that has existed for most of man's existence, with or without a genocide law. With just over a month left in office, President Bush was persuaded by personal appeals from a U.S. ambassador in Kenya and 2 U.S. senators to intervene in Somalia. This was a conflict that Bush thought would be easier to manage than the conflict caused by Slobodan Milosevic stoking the flames of ethnic hatred and Serbian supremacy in Yugoslavia. Clinton campaigned on acknowledging the atrocities in Bosnia, but once elected, he would do everything to avoid a military conflict, even with high public approval for military action. The Somalia intervention further solidified Clinton's apprehension when a U.S. Black Hawk helicopter was shot down and the pilot was dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. Multilateral humanitarian missions seemed to bring all risk and no gain. Clinton was not a military expert. He relied on the expertise of Warren Christopher, Madeleine Albright, and Colin Powell. Powell adopted former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger's military doctrine that restricted military action to situations involving 1. Vital U.S. interests, 2. The intent of winning, 3. Clearly defined political and military objectives, 4. Widespread public and congressional support, and 5. To be used only as a last resort. Powell amended this doctrine to include 6. Decisive force, and 7. A clear exit strategy. Although one could argue that it was in the long-term U.S. interest to intervene in Bosnia, especially since Osama bin Laden would eventually exploit the situation to recruit for al-Qaeda, there were no short-term interests so to speak of. In the middle of all of this, decades of turmoil in Rwanda erupted into a full-blown genocidal campaign. President Juvenal Habyarimana's plane was shot down on its approach into Kigali, making him the first official victim of the genocide. The genocidaires blamed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the rebel group led by Rwanda's current president, Paul Kagame. 800,000 Tutsi became implicated victims and were massacred over a 100-day span between April and July 1994. The force commander of UNAMIR, General Romeo Dallaire, was sounding the alarm, but the UN was in complete denial and Dallaire's request fell on deaf ears. Clinton, still squeamish from the Somalia backlash, didn't want anything to do with Rwanda and actively tried to prevent a coordinated response. In Clinton-esque fashion, the State Department spokesperson, Christine Shelley, had to explain that the events in Rwanda only constituted acts of genocide, but not genocide, as calling it what it was would obligate the United States to take action. In terms of public opinion and the political calculus, one American life was worth that of about 85,000 Rwandans. It was as if there were 800,000 Rwandans on a trolley track, and the U.S. could pull a lever that would save them, but was unwilling because the trolley would be diverted and kill more than 10 American soldiers. The Rwandan Patriotic Front was eventually victorious and halted the genocide. In just a year after Rwanda, another unthinkable event happened. The UN-protected safe zone of Srebrenica that harbored 40,000 Muslims fell to the Serbs. Neither the UN, NATO, nor the US were adequately prepared to protect it, and 8,000 were killed. This event, as horrible as it was, changed the calculus. The political cost of inaction finally outweighed the political cost of action. Clinton was ready to stop the wishful thinking and start the bombing campaigns. Until then, the Serbians had no fear that the U.S. would do anything. The U.S.-led NATO campaigns changed the tide of war, and Clinton became the savior of Kosovo and stopped the Serbs from wiping out the Kosovo Albanians. Since there isn't yet a national or multinational law for the climate, the battle is focused on preventing or acquiring these laws. Just as Lemkin had realized, this is the battle for public opinion and political will. Efforts by those that realized what was happening early on, such as James Hansen and Bill McKibben, have helped to lay the groundwork for the rest of us. It was McKibben's 2012 article, Global Warming's Terrifying New Math, that exposed me to the urgency of our dilemma. Hansen was one of the first scientist activists and has been a strong advocate for a revenue-neutral carbon tax. McKibben has developed a large network of 350.org organizers and helped create the overarching movement that is necessary to change the political calculus towards action. Democrats' reactions to President Trump's intent to withdraw from the Paris Accord and their appeal for climate justice have helped to shift their party. While the pandemic or social justice issues fill the news, President Trump is using this as cover to bail out the fossil fuel industry. The head of the EPA, Andrew Wheeler, is excusing noncompliance of environmental standards if it can be shown that it resulted from the pandemic. The Koch brothers have been extraordinarily successful at shaping public opinion. They were responsible for creating a massive misinformation campaign and turning climate denial from a fringe group into mainstream. ExxonMobil scientists also knew the dangers of climate change very early on, and Exxon also chose to fund climate change denial, although they only spent a fraction of what the Kochs spent. Just like the coronavirus, early action is essential, and the trajectory we take is up to us. But unlike the pandemic, there will be no eventual return to normal after a vaccine. The problems and disruptions that we're creating now could be here for thousands of years to come. Even if we collectively choose to look away from the people that are being affected now, this trolley goes around and comes around. We have to start hitting the brakes. Denial is the natural human state. These anti-genocide activists that have passionately pursued their causes weren't born that way. Something happened in their lives that haunts them and makes it so they can no longer look away. Others may justify their indifference, but for many, it's only because they haven't yet experienced that life-altering event. For Raphael Lemkin, it was his knowledge and understanding of history, linguistics, and law that allowed him to see how the rise of the Nazis would affect him personally, even before it actually happened. The death of his family only further solidified his obsession. Peter Galbraith also had a natural inclination to be a do-gooder, but it wasn't until he met the Kurds and saw the destruction of their villages with his own eyes that he became obsessed with their cause. The congressman from Indiana, Frank McCloskey, who was an outspoken advocate for U.S. military intervention in Bosnia, had his life-changing moment when he was shelled by the Serbs while visiting the Croatian city of Osijek. It was a university town that reminded him of Bloomington. This association, coupled with the massacres he witnessed and the lies he was told by Milosevic, brought the conflict home for him. The senator from Kansas, Bob Dole, was injured by a shell during World War II while trying to save his radio man during an attack on a machine gun nest. A reconstructive surgeon, Dr. Hampar Kalekian, heard his story and offered to operate on Dole if he could find the train fare to Chicago. While recovering, Dr. Kalekian recounted to the young war hero about his escape of the Armenian genocide and the loss of some of his family members. Dole had not heard of this before, but these stories stuck with him, and he saw too many similarities in the events unfolding in Yugoslavia. To someone that hasn't made these associations, these activists seem like troublesome radicals. They truly are living outside of the societal norms. But some things, once seen, cannot be unseen, and it can be very difficult to remember what life was like before that life-changing event happened. These crusaders are willing to risk everything based on their principles. Lemkin was fired as deputy public prosecutor for criticizing Hitler. He tried his best not to be judgmental, but he would often slip up, as was evident by the tone of his letters. Many people found him irritating. Peter Galbraith was one of the first to be laid off during cutbacks after complaining about changes to the McGovern Amendment to allow U.S. humanitarian assistance to Cambodia. He also risked his job and personal safety by breaking the rules and traveling to Iraqi Kurdistan. Frank McCluskey lost re-election because of the perception that he focused more on Bosnia than Indiana. And in the most desperate attempt of them all, Shmuel Ziegelboim, a Jewish member of the Polish National Council in London, was so frustrated and demoralized that his advocacy was not spurring people to action that he decided to take his own life and publish a suicide note in the New York Times in hopes that it would get people to notice. His note had the headline, "He denounced apathy," but even this act of desperation wouldn't alter Allied policy. Genocide has been referred to as the greatest crime in history, and one can argue that according to the legal definition of genocide, climate change is multiple genocides, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. The perpetrators hide behind their denial to pretend that their intent is not to destroy, but either consciously or subconsciously, they know what they're causing to happen. This is a genocide with the potential to harm billions, and people, especially young people, are getting desperate because time is running out. In the battle for political will, the oppositional media will portray these activists as radicals that aren't like us. They'll find people that don't look and act like us. But overall, these are ordinary people. They're students and they're teachers. They're not yet old enough to vote and they're retired. They're just ordinary people that have decided to stop avoiding troubling information and do something about it. These people are willing to give up their time and even risk arrest in an attempt to stop the largest injustice in history. No one wants to make these sacrifices, but they must because they can't live with their knowledge and not do all they can. In 2010, South Carolina Congressman Bob Inglis, who had a lifetime rating of 93 from the American Conservative Union, lost his seat to a Tea Party challenger because his daughter had convinced him that climate change was real and man-made. In many Republican districts, a candidate that acknowledges climate change won't stand a chance of keeping their job. Since then, Inglis has gone on to launch the Energy and Enterprise Initiative and is the executive director of Republican. Tim DeChristopher spent 21 months in prison for a false auction bid in 2008. He outbid oil companies for a parcel of land near national parks in Utah. He used his platform as a political prisoner to garner media attention. The entire organization of Extinction Rebellion is built around the idea that civil disobedience is our best chance at stopping the climate crisis. They've designed a system that trains citizens to peacefully protest and get arrested. They work with the police to ensure that the protests stay peaceful. Greta Thunberg first learned of climate change when she was 8. She was in disbelief that everyone seemed to be acting as if nothing were wrong and became very depressed. She became an activist but was frustrated with the pace with which change was happening, so she decided to take a chance on a new idea. She started a school strike to pressure the Swedish government to action. At first it was just her, but she managed to grow her strike into a global movement. Indigenous people are on the front lines of climate change. They're either forced from their land because of development, or their way of life is affected because of the impacts of the changing climate. Many of them are trying to protect their land, and their way of life are met with violence by those who profit at their expense. Even in the U.S., the Standing Rock Sioux that were protecting their rivers from the Dakota Access Pipeline were met with fire hoses in December. Everyone needs to decide for themselves how far they're willing to go. Personally, I'm not at a point in my life where I could be willing to risk arrest, or my job, or my personal safety, or my relationships. But I do what works for me, which is to take personal responsibility, talk about the climate, call my members of Congress, and occasionally even respond to the newspaper in order to build political will. Albert O. Hirschman's rhetoric of reaction was one of the foundational factors in A Problem from Hell. The thesis goes that when someone argues in favor of inaction, they tend to use one of 3 narratives to justify their position. These narratives are futility, perversity, and jeopardy. Some examples of futility are when wars are described as being caused by ancient hatreds, so that there's nothing that can be done. This is how Rwanda was spoken of, even though the Rwandans got along well enough until the Belgians created racial divides in the early 20th century. Another way is through false equivalence, like calling something a civil war when not all sides are equal. This is the propaganda used in Syria. The peaceful protesters wanted democracy, and they were forced to take up arms after it became clear that the regime would resort to brutal tactics. Perversity is when an attempt to improve the condition will ultimately end up exacerbating it. At a State Department assembly, the Principal Deputy Assistant for European Affairs, Ralph Johnson, explained that they were afraid to attempt to liberate the camps in Bosnia because there would be retaliation and the prisoners inside would be killed. Elie Wiesel responded, "Do you realize that is precisely what the State Department said during World War II? Jeopardy occurs when, by attempting to improve the condition, some other aspect is endangered. American lives could be lost, like when the Black Hawk helicopter was shot down, or a relationship with a country like Iraq or China could be compromised." On the flip side, progressive narratives also tend to fall into three distinct categories: synergy, imminent danger, and history is on our side. The point is that people are hardwired to be influenced by narratives, but narratives alone aren't an objective measure of reality. We need to seek evidence beyond the narratives to validate or invalidate them.
The same narratives can be applied to climate change. Many say that it's futile or hopeless. I would argue that it's not a good way to look at it. It's a creeping problem. It's too late to stop climate change completely, but every day we delay makes it that much worse, and every action we take makes it that much less bad. False narratives are used to delay climate policy too. People hate taxes. If we taxed fossil fuels, the companies would pass the costs on to consumers and everything would become more expensive. They say this would especially hurt the poor. This would be perverse since the poor are especially vulnerable to climate change. The solution is to rebate 100% of the tax revenue back to the public in equal amounts. This would help the poor grow the economy and encourage innovation. But wouldn't this hurt our competitive advantage and put the economy in jeopardy? Not if a border adjustment was applied. This would keep the country competitive and incentivize other countries to pass similar legislation. The Green New Deal is a comprehensive plan to address climate change. It helped get the left excited about climate policy, but at the same time it reinforces the narrative on the right that the threats of big government and regulations. This causes solution aversion and reinforces denial. Is the Green New Deal synergistic? Possibly, but there are always unforeseen consequences of any policy. Not that it's futile, though. There is tremendous economic opportunity right now if we choose to act. Is there an imminent danger? Depends on what you consider to be imminent. Some people are being affected by climate change right now, while others may go decades without noticing the downside. But climate change is going to impact all of us in a multitude of ways. And if our inability to get a handle on genocide is a clue, history is definitely not on our side. Revenue-neutral carbon taxes, on the other hand, have conservative political intellectual capital, and conservative groups like the Climate Leadership Council, as well as nonpartisan groups like Citizens Climate Lobby, are pushing for this idea. It isn't an all-in-one package like the Green New Deal, but it is expected to be the single most effective component of a climate action plan. And there's no reason why it can't be included with the Green New Deal. The only way to make an informed decision is to understand the conflict and the narratives involved. Everything adapts, and the same tactics rarely work twice in a row. Lemkin was one of the few that recognized what Hitler was planning on doing. The narrative that the Germans were civilized people, not savages, was used to downplay the threat, but Lemkin knew better. Unfortunately, those around him, including his family, still assumed that the Germans would let them be, as they did during World War I. The false equivalency between Vietnam and Cambodia as both communist countries in Indochina blinded the U.S. to the relevant differences in the conflicts. Pol Pot's Cambodia was nothing like Vietnam in many ways. Representative George McGovern of South Dakota made the distinction. Many couldn't understand why he went from being a dove over Vietnam to a hawk over Cambodia as a result. Clinton's debacle in Somalia influenced his policy in Rwanda and Bosnia. These were all independent conflicts. According to General Dallaire's assessment, 5,000 troops in total would probably have stopped the slaughter in Rwanda. Clinton's inaction served to embolden Milosevic, who conducted his massacres without any fear of retaliation. When the political pressure in the U.S. reached a tipping point, Milosevic wasn't prepared. After the defeat of Milosevic, it would seem the story would go that inaction abetted genocide and action stopped it. This was the context with which the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003. Only this time, the intelligence was bad, and the intervention turned out to be a costly mistake. In Syria, protesters thought that nonviolent civil disobedience would be a viable pathway to democracy based on the success stories coming out of Tunisia and Egypt. Syria is not Tunisia nor Egypt. The military would actively support its leader, not turn against him. Assad even chose to violently suppress the peaceful uprisings in 2011, even though it increased outrage against him. One theory is that he couldn't allow the formation of a safe public space that could be transformed into political dialogue. The Solidarity Organization in Poland was allowed this space, and that regime eventually lost power. Some Syrian protesters are also fearful that the U.S. would invade their country like they did in Iraq, completely unaware that the narrative in the U.S. has swung back towards non-intervention. People have tried to tie climate change to the last environmental problem. If climate change is like the ozone hole, then all we need to do is regulate and stop emitting the gases that cause the problem, just as President Reagan had done. But it turns out that regulating greenhouse gases is far more difficult than phasing out a few aerosols. By the way,
Reagan's Secretary of State George Shultz is a supporter of a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Perhaps climate change is like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides that cause acid rain. Then we could use an approach like cap and trade, just like President Bush had done. These free market approaches to environmentalism fit perfectly with conservative Republican ideology and were considered the holy grail of environmental policymaking at the time. Spurring technological innovation to create scrubbers is one thing, but to do this on the scale for carbon dioxide is a completely different matter. George Marshall, author of Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change, suggests that a better environmental comparison would have been leaded gasoline. At least here we could focus on the inputs rather than the outputs. He claims that this explains the seeming hypocrisy that politicians can say they are addressing global warming and at the same time approve more fossil fuel extraction. Any serious policy needs to consider the wellhead and the tailpipe, supply and demand. The misinformation campaign waged by the Tetra at the lead lobby was also similar. The lead battle spanned from 1924 until 1996, and the lobby claimed it was safe, contrary to the mounting evidence. There are genocidal hotspots popping up all over the world, and climate change is only going to create the conditions to exacerbate this even further. People of several faiths are being persecuted. 1 in 7 of the 300 million Christians live in countries that suffer from some form of persecution. India is inflaming anti-Muslim rhetoric. Pakistan is persecuting all non-Muslim religious minorities. The Rohingya Muslims are being driven out of Myanmar by Buddhists. The list of countries involved in religious persecution is long. Even in the United States, anti-Semitic hate crimes against Jews have gone up dramatically in the past few years. Many former genocidal countries are still in denial. The Armenian genocide was well documented at the time of its occurrence, but the official denial of Turkey has covered it up and the denial has become part of the Turkish national identity. Indonesia still engages in official denial over East Timor. The United States has its own denial over the loss of the Native American people and cultures. Denial is a necessary component of genocide, so it's no surprise. I've always been anti-war. Growing up, I was thankful that I wasn't alive during World War II because that would have caused a moral dilemma. A war to stop genocide seems like an exception to the rule. Even just watching Holocaust films left me feeling depressed because I knew they were based on real events. As horrible as past atrocities have been, current atrocities are a whole different thing. When I was young, I wasn't aware of what was happening. I didn't read the newspaper, and Iraq, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur weren't topics that I heard anyone discuss. I heard of them, but I didn't really know what happened there or why I should care, so I didn't seek out more information. Now I recognize this as my own state of denial. Genocide occurs far more often than we like to think. Never again is a myth, but it can also be a principle we live by. Last October, the U.S. Congress overwhelmingly voted in favor of recognizing the Armenian genocide. The Senate effort was led by Bob Menendez and Ted Cruz. Much more recently, Congress once again had overwhelming support led by Bob Menendez, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and others to impose sanctions on China for human rights abuses and genocide of the Uyghur Muslims. The public should encourage this behavior and keep putting pressure on politicians to do more. One way to show support is to call your member of Congress and tell them you appreciate their support, or tweet your appreciation to other members of Congress. This isn't going away, and what we do matters. Climate change isn't something that's just happening. It's something that we're doing. On the one hand, the fact that we're implicated with the cause makes us want to look the other way. But on the other, it can give us hope that we have the power to stop it. It's too late to stop it completely, it's already here. But every year we delay makes the problem that much worse. We need to act regardless of the outcome, otherwise what are we living for? There are tipping points. 1.5 degrees is the genocidal destruction of low-lying island nations. 2 degrees could likely bring on the extinction of coral reefs, leading to food insecurity for hundreds of millions. Economic and societal collapse could follow. This is our generation's 1930s. We can't afford to look the other way now. If our long-time ongoing struggle to address genocide is any clue, the climate struggle is going to be more of the same. The stakes just keep rising. Just like for genocide, the solutions lie in getting the people to say enough is enough. We need to transition our governments since the governments we need don't yet exist. We have to continue to apply political pressure to our current leaders to act and our future leaders to emerge. There is also such tremendous opportunity now to transition our economies toward the future. While powerful individuals may benefit from holding us back, clean energy is the future. The leader of the free world needs to lead, or our economy is going to fall behind. If you want to help out, my advice is to educate yourself, not just on the science, but on the policy too. Unlike just a few years ago, there are now several climate bills in Congress, some with bipartisan support. Find the ones that you like and call your member of Congress every month and ask them to support your preferred climate legislation. Getting calls from constituents is extremely influential for policymakers. Thanks for watching. Now let's all get to work and fix this mess. Well, there he is, the guy that built the genocide law. Still got a lot of work to do, but we're going to continue your fight.